I run a small cattle operation up in Madison County. 40 head on a couple hundred acres my family's held for 3 generations. And I've spent my whole life on that land. Know every fold and draw of it, the way you know the back of your own hand. I tell you that so you'll understand I'm not a man given to seeing things. A cattleman's a practical sort. You deal in fence and feed and weather, and the plain hard facts of keeping animals alive through a mountain winter. And you don't last long at it if you're the fanciful kind. So when I tell you what stood at the top of my back pasture, I need you to know it comes from a man who spent a long time trying to explain it away, and couldn't, and has had to live with that. The back pasture runs uphill from the house, a long green slope that climbs to where the woods start at the top, a hard dark tree line of oak and poplar and hemlock that marks the edge of my land and the start of the national forest beyond. I'd looked at that tree line 10,000 times in my life, at every hour and in every season, and it was just the woods, the place the pasture ended. Until one evening in the fall, at dusk, that failing blue hour when the light's going and the shadows come down off the ridges, I looked up the slope from the porch, and there was a man standing in it, not out in the pasture. In the tree line, right at the edge, just inside the shadow of the first trees, so that he was more a shape than a man, an upright darkness among the vertical dark of the trunks. But he was a man, the size and stand of a man, and he was facing down the slope, facing the house, facing me, and I did the thing anybody does, the automatic thing, the neighborly reflex bred into you up here. I raised my hand, lifted it in that half wave you give a figure across a distance, the wave that says I see you. Howdy, no trouble here. And he didn't move. He didn't wave back, didn't lift a hand, didn't come on down the way a man does when he's been seen and wants to talk, didn't turn and go the way a man does when he's been caught somewhere he oughtn't be. He just stood there in the edge of the trees, with my raised hand hanging in the air between us. And after a moment, I felt foolish and lowered it, and still he stood, and something about that stillness put the first cool touch of wrongness on the back of my neck. I whistled up my dogs. I had 2 good ones then, a pair of curs that would tree a bear and think it was fun. And I started up the pasture toward him, not fast, just walking up to see who was standing in my woods at dusk. And by the time I got to the top, he was gone. There was no one in the tree line. I walked the edge of it a good way in both directions, and I looked into the woods where the light was already gone to full dark under the canopy, and there was nothing, no one, no sound of anybody moving off through the brush. And here's the first thing that I couldn't put down, the first splinter that worked its way in. The ground up there was soft. We'd had rain, and the edge of the pasture where it met the woods was damp black dirt, and a man standing there would have left prints, and a man leaving in a hurry would have left more. There were none, not one track that wasn't mine or the dogs. And the dogs, my 2 bear-treeing dogs, hadn't come up with me. I turned around, and they were down at the bottom of the pasture, both of them standing stiff-legged with their hackles up, watching me and the tree line. And they would not come up, not for whistle, nor call, nor curse. And finally, I gave it up and walked back down to them, and they near about climbed up me with relief. I told myself it was a hunter. That's what you do. Some fellow from off turned around in the forest, come to the edge of the trees to get his bearings, and seen he was on private land, and slipped off quiet. It didn't account for the tracks or the dogs, but it was a shape I could hold, and I held it, and I went to bed. He came back the next evening. Same hour, that same failing blue dusk. Same spot exact, as if he'd been set there like a fence post. Same stand, facing the house. I was ready this time, watching for it, and when the light started to go, I looked up the slope and there he was, the upright dark shape in the edge of the trees. And this time, I did not wave. I stood on my porch, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, or faced me, across the length of that long green pasture, and neither of us moved, and the dusk came down, and at some point, between one glance and the next, he simply was not there anymore. I didn't see him go. He was there, and then the light was gone, and then he wasn't. And that became the shape of my evenings. He came every dusk. Not every single one, but most, enough that I came to expect him, to feel the day tilt toward that hour, with a dread that grew slow and steady like a thing taking root. Always the same spot, always facing the house. Never closer, never farther, never any nearer to the fence than that first line of trees. A man made of patience, standing sentry over my home at the edge of my own woods, and my dogs would not go up that pasture again. Not ever, not in daylight, not for anything. They'd work every other inch of that farm, glad as you please, but the back slope had become a thing they wouldn't cross. And they'd stand at the bottom of it with their hackles up and whine, low. That whine a dog makes at a thing you can't see, and it did more to convince me than anything my own eyes showed me. A dog doesn't talk itself into anything. A dog doesn't get fanciful at dusk. A dog knows. It was old Harlan Green who told me, finally, what I was looking at, or as much of it as anybody knew. Harlan farmed the next place over, an old man even then, his people back in that country as far as mine, and I'd been careful not to speak of it to anyone, because a man in my business can't have it going around that he's seeing things at dusk. But Harlan came by, about a strayed heifer one afternoon, and we got to talking at the fence, and I don't know what made me do it, except that I couldn't carry it alone anymore. But I asked him, careful, had he ever heard of anybody seeing a man up in the tree line at the top of the back pasture? And Harlan went still. He looked at me a long moment, and then he looked up the slope toward the woods, and his face did a thing I didn't like, closed up and went old. He said the man who'd owned my place before my grandfather bought it had seen him, and that the family before that had seen him too. That as far back as anybody in that country could remember, there'd been a watcher in that tree line at the top of that particular pasture. And that it wasn't a thing you talked about, it was a thing you learned to live alongside, like the weather or the hard ground. And then Harlan told me the rule, and he told it to me plain and hard, gripping the top wire of the fence with his old hand, looking me dead in the eye so I'd take it serious. You don't go to him, Harlan said. You've likely already learned that. You go up, he's gone, no harm. That's fine. Go up all you want, he won't be there. But here's the one that matters, son. You don't ever wave him in. You don't call to him. You don't beckon him. You don't raise your hand to him and bid him come. Whatever you do, however long he stands there, you never once invite him down. I asked Harlan what happened if you did. And that hard old man, who'd looked me in the eye the whole time, would not look at me then. He looked off up the mountain and worked his jaw, and finally he just said, "You don't do it." And that was all I could get out of him. And he left not long after with a look on him like he was sorry he'd said as much as he had. I thought about that first evening. I thought about my hand going up in that easy neighborly wave, before I knew, before any of it. And I felt a cold go through me that I have never entirely shook since, because I had waved, that first night. I had raised my hand to him, and he had not come. And I have spent a long time wondering whether that's because a wave given in ignorance doesn't count, or whether it does count, and it only takes a while. And everything since has been him coming, slow, the only way he comes. Because I kept the rule after that, all these years. I never once raised my hand to him again. I'd see him at dusk, and I'd keep my hands at my sides or in my pockets, or gripped on the porch rail, and I'd make myself look away. And I lived alongside him the way Harlan said you had to, the way the owners before me had, a watcher in the tree line, and a family in the house, and a long green pasture of understanding between them that neither crossed. Years of that, I near about made my peace with it. A man can get used to almost anything, even a thing that stands at the edge of his woods every evening and watches him with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. But he doesn't keep to the tree line anymore. It started so slow I couldn't say when it changed. But this past year, I began to notice he wasn't quite at the trees. He was a little down the slope from them, and then a little more. And I understood, with a sick lurch, that in all those years of never being closer and never being farther, the not farther had been the lie, that he had been closer all along, so slow you couldn't catch it, the way you can't catch the hour hand moving. By this past fall, he was standing at my pasture fence, right down at the fence at the bottom of the slope, near enough now that I could see he was tall, too tall and thin, and that he stood a little wrong, and that where his face should have been there was only a paleness with no features on it at all, a blank patient waiting, turned toward my house through the coming dark. And last night I looked out my window, the way I do, at that failing hour, and he was not at the fence. He was in the yard. My yard. Close. Close enough that there was no more pretending distance, standing on my own grass in the blue dark facing my door. And I could see him plain, for the first time in all these years, the height of him, and the wrongness of him, and the pale blank patience where a face belongs. And I understood that all his long slow coming had brought him here, to the last of the ground between us, to my own dooryard, and that there is nowhere closer left for him to come, except across my threshold. And here is the thing I have to tell you, the thing that has me writing this down in the daylight, with the doors locked and my hands shaking, because I don't know how much time I've got, or how much of my own self I can trust when that hour comes around again tonight. When I looked out and saw him standing in my yard, close, waiting, turned toward me with that blank and patient face, after all these years of standing sentry at the edge of my life, my hand started to lift, on its own. I felt it rise off the windowsill, the old easy neighborly reflex. The wave, the come on then. The same motion I made that first innocent evening a lifetime ago, and there was a part of me, a tired part, a part that has watched him at dusk for more years than I can bear, that wanted to finish it, that wanted to just raise my hand and wave him in and be done with the waiting, because the waiting is its own kind of dying, and he has been so patient and I am so tired. I caught my wrist with my other hand. I held it down. I stood there in the dark, holding my own arm, down against the pull of it, and I did not wave. And after a while the hour passed, and he was gone from the yard. But he'll be back tonight. He's closer every night now, and there's no more pasture left to cross. And I don't know, I truly don't know, on some evening when I'm lonesome and worn down past caring, whether I'll be quick enough to catch my own hand. Harlan's in the ground these 10 years and never did tell me what happens if you wave him in. But I think I've finally understood the shape of it, the thing that old man couldn't make himself say. I don't think anything bad happens when you wave him in. I think that's the trap of it. I think he comes at last and stands with you, close, a companion after all those years of watching from the trees. And I think he keeps you company from then on, near and patient and faithful. And I think that's exactly what I'll want one of these tired nights. And I think that's exactly why my grandfather and the men before him kept the rule so hard and passed it down so grim. Not because waving him in brings something terrible, but because it brings something that feels, in the lonesome dark, like a mercy. And once you've waved him into the yard, into the house, into the chair beside you, you become the next thing that stands in the tree line at dusk, watching the house, waiting for whoever comes after to raise their hand. My son and I leased a piece of hunting ground in Pocahontas County. The fall he turned 16, a few hundred acres of hardwood timber and laurel back off a forest road where the mountains fold up steep and the hollows run deep and dark. It was good ground, thick with deer, and it was ours for the season. And I'll tell you, there's not much in this life better than having a piece of country to hunt with your boy. Watching him learn the woods the way my own father taught me. We spent that early fall scouting it, walking the ridges and the creek bottoms, learning where the deer moved and bedded and fed. And it was during that scouting that we found the old stand. And I wish to God we'd left it alone, or better yet, never found it at all. It was an old wooden deer stand, back in the timber on a bench about halfway up one of the ridges, and it had plainly been there a long time, longer than our lease, longer maybe than the man we leased from had held the land. It was built the old way, out of dimensional lumber, gone gray and silver with weather. Boards nailed up into the crotch of a big red oak, a platform and a rail and a little bench to sit on, maybe 12 feet up. The kind of permanent stand men used to build back when you hunted the same tree your whole life. It had held up better than you'd think, the oak having grown partway around the boards, holding them fast, and my boy wanted to hunt it right off, because it was set in a good spot, up on that bench, with a view down into the hollow. But there was something about it that I didn't like from the first, and it took me a while to work out what. It was the deer, or the lack of them. Everywhere on that lease we found good sign, trails beaten into the leaves, rubs on the saplings where the bucks worked their antlers, scrapes pawed out under the licking branches, the whole living traffic of the deer woods, everywhere but around that stand. There was a circle, maybe 80 yards across, with the old stand at the dead center of it, where there was nothing, no trails through it, no rubs, no scrapes, no droppings, no beds. The sign would come right up to the edge of that circle from every direction and then stop and turn and go around, the way water goes around a stone. The deer had drawn a boundary in those woods that a man couldn't see, but they could, and they kept to their side of it, and the old gray stand sat in the middle of that dead ground, like the hub of a wheel, with nothing living daring the spokes. I noticed it and I didn't like it, but I didn't have a name for why, and a practical man doesn't refuse a good stand over a feeling. So one afternoon, scouting, I climbed it, just to glass the ridge above, to see the lay of the country from up high. My boy stayed down at the bottom of the oak, and I hadn't been up on that platform 10 minutes, sitting on that old weathered bench with my binoculars, before it came over me. That feeling, I expect you know the one. The crawling certainty that you are being watched, that prickle that starts at the base of your skull and runs down between your shoulder blades. The oldest alarm we've got, older than words, the one that kept our people alive, back when something was always hunting them in the dark. It came over me strong and sudden, the absolute conviction that there were eyes on me, close, and I turned around slow on that bench, expecting to catch some big buck that had slipped in behind me, or a bear, or a man. There was nothing. Only the woods, the gray trunks going back and back, the leaves coming down, the empty timber. Nothing that could account for it. But turning around didn't help, that's the thing. The feeling didn't ease when I saw there was nothing there. It stayed, exactly as strong, as if the eyes were still on me, as if whatever was watching didn't care that I'd looked, or was somewhere looking couldn't be looked back at. And the worst of it, the part that got up under my skin and has never fully gotten out, was where the feeling came from. It came from behind me and above me, from up over my shoulder. And there was nothing above me on that stand. I was at the top of it. There was nothing over my head but the crown of that oak and the open sky. And yet the sense of being studied came down from up there, from above and behind, patient and close and cold. And I got down off that stand a good deal faster than I'd climbed up it. And I didn't glass anything, and my boy looked at my face when I reached the bottom and didn't ask. I meant to hunt it anyway. I'm stubborn, and it was a good spot. And I'd talked myself half out of it by the time we came back opening morning. I sent my boy to a stand down on the creek, and I climbed the old gray one in the dark before dawn, and I set myself on that bench to wait for light, and I lasted maybe an hour, because it came back, that feeling, and it was worse in the dark. Worse waiting for a dawn that seemed like it would never come, sitting there with the certainty of eyes on the back of my neck, growing and growing until I could not stand it, until every hair on me was standing up, and my heart was going like I'd run a mile, and there was nothing there. I knew there was nothing there, and it did not matter one bit. Something was studying the back of my neck, something up over my shoulder in a place where nothing could be. I came down out of that stand in the gray light shaking, and I have never in my life, before or since, been so glad to have my boots on the ground. I couldn't hunt it after that. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish. An old woodsman spooked like a boy. But a body knows what it knows, and mine had decided that stand was death and would not let me sit it. And my boy, I hadn't told him any of what I felt, not wanting to put it in his head, but a week or so in he came to me and said, not quite meeting my eye, that he didn't want to hunt the oak stand anymore. I asked him why, careful, and he shrugged the way boys do, and said he just didn't like it up there, that it felt like somebody was behind him, and he couldn't shake it. And hearing my own feeling come out of my son's mouth, unprompted, a boy who didn't know a thing about what I'd felt, that was worse than any of it, because it meant it wasn't in my head. It was in that stand, and it had reached for him too. It was an old man at the gas station down at the crossroads who gave me the rest of it. I stopped in for coffee and gas the way you do, and got to talking with him, the old fellow who seemed like he'd been sitting by that register since the beginning of time. And I mentioned we were hunting the lease up the forest road, and described about where, and his face changed. He asked me, kind of sideways, had we found the old wooden stand back on the bench? I said we had, and he nodded slow, like that confirmed something he was sorry to have confirmed, and he told me not to hunt it. Just like that, plain. Don't hunt that stand. I asked him why, and he told me. He said years back, he was vague on how many, a long time, decades, a man had hunted that stand. An older fellow hunted it every year, his stand, the one he'd built maybe, or inherited. And one fall he'd climbed up into it in the morning to hunt, and he'd sat down on that bench, and he'd died. His heart, most likely the old man said, just quit on him, sitting up there in the quiet timber, waiting on a deer. And being as he hunted alone, and being as it was back in that dead timber where nobody went, nobody found him. He sat up in that stand, dead, for a long, long time before anybody came looking and worked out where he'd got to. A long time, the old man said again, and let that sit, and I understood him to mean the man had sat up there through the rest of that season, and maybe past it, dead on his bench, upright, studying the empty woods, with eyes that didn't see anymore, a long, slow, forgotten while. And ever since, the old man said, that stand isn't right. He didn't call it haunted, didn't use any word like that. He said the stand hunts you now. He said it sits up there in the dark timber where nothing living will go. And I thought of that dead circle, the deer that wouldn't cross it, and it waits. It waits for somebody to do the one thing that stand knows, the thing it was built for, and the thing that happened in it. It waits for somebody to climb up into it and sit down on that bench and go still. And when you do, the old man said, when you climb up and sit and go quiet the way you do to hunt, it studies you. It studies the back of your neck, patient, the way that dead man studied the woods in his last long hours, and all the long forgotten while after, sitting up there gone still, waiting and waiting for something to finally come into range that never did. I have thought about that more than I want to, about what it is to sit up in a tree, still, quiet, watching, hour on hour, waiting for something to come to you. That's the whole act of hunting from a stand. When you get down to it, you make yourself into a patient stillness up above the ground, and you wait for a living thing to wander into your reach. And I have come to think that whatever that old man became, sitting dead in that stand through the long empty months, it learned that shape so deep it never let it go, that it's up there yet, being what it was in death, a patience above the ground, and that when a warm living thing climbs up and sits down and goes still within its reach, it does the only thing it knows how to do. It watches. It waits. It studies the back of your neck, patient as the dead are patient, waiting for the moment to take what has finally, after all this time, come into range. We finished out that season on the rest of the lease, and we never sat the oak stand again, either of us, and we didn't renew the next year, and I told the man we leased from it was too far to drive, which was a lie. But here is the part that stays with me, the part I turn over on the nights I can't sleep. The old man at the gas station said, the stand waits for someone to climb up and sit and go still within its reach. And I did that, twice. I climbed up into it, and I sat down on that bench, and I went still, the way you do. And both times I felt it studying the back of my neck, patient and close and cold, from up over my shoulder where nothing could be. It had me in range. Both times, it had me exactly where it had been waiting all those years for someone to be. And I have never understood why nothing happened, why I got down both times and drove home, and am here to tell it. Unless the answer is the one I can't quite make myself look at straight, which is that a thing that has been patient that long, a thing that waited dead and forgotten through a whole season, and more for something to come into range, is not a thing that's ever in a hurry. That maybe it doesn't take you the day you climb up, that maybe it just gets a good long look at the back of your neck and learns you and marks you, and then waits. The way it's so terribly good at waiting, for you to come to it again, or for it, having learned the way home in the back of your neck, to come, slow and patient, and sure to you. I took the fire tower caretaker job on a bald in the Black Mountains, the year I decided I'd had enough of people for a while. And I'll tell you up front that I got what I asked for, and then some. The tower sat on the very top of a bald, one of those high grassy domes that rise up bare above the tree line in that country, the highest ground for miles, and the job was mostly maintenance in the off-season. Keeping the structure sound, logging the weather, seeing to the equipment, being a set of hands and eyes up on that mountain through the long stretches when there was no fire danger and no lookout posted. It meant being alone up there for weeks at a stretch, supplied by a hard drive, up a service road that washed out if you looked at it wrong. Cut off from everything, just me and the wind and the enormous silence of the high country. I thought that would suit me. For a while it did. The tower itself was the old kind, a steel frame maybe 60 feet up, with a little glass-walled cab at the top, the cab where the lookout would sit in season and watch the ridges for smoke. I lived in a cabin at the base, but I spent my evenings up in the cab, because the view from up there was the whole reason a person could stand the loneliness. You could see the mountains roll away in every direction. Range behind range behind range, going blue, and then bluer with distance. And at dusk, the light would do things across all that country that I don't have the words for. I'd take my coffee up there and sit in the cab as the day went down, the one lit window on the top of the whole dark world. And for the first few weeks, it was the most peace I'd ever known. It was through that glass, at dusk, that I first saw them. Across the gap, there was a deep gap, or saddle, between my bald and the next ridge over, a mile of open air, maybe, and on the crest of that far ridge, along the top where the trees met the sky, there were figures. People was my first thought, plain and simple. A line of people standing along the ridgeline, dark against the last of the light. And my second thought was hikers, or hunters, some group up on the ridge, taking in the same sunset I was. There were a number of them, spaced out along the crest, all of them upright, all of them still, and all of them. I could tell even at that distance, facing my way, facing the tower. I got my binoculars and I glassed them, expecting them to resolve into men with packs and rifles, and they didn't resolve. That's the thing. Up close in the glass, they were exactly what they'd been to the naked eye. Only bigger. Tall, dark uprights, featureless, no faces, no gear, no color, just standing shapes, man-shaped and man-sized, motionless along the top of that far ridge. I counted them. There were 11. I told myself the sensible thing, the thing you have to tell yourself when you live alone on a mountain and want to keep your mind. Rocks, dead snags, the standing gray trunks of trees, killed by the balsam blight, which are everywhere up in that country, tall and dark and stark. The eye makes men out of shapes at distance and at dusk. Everybody knows that. The brain is built to see people where there's a hint of a person. Better to mistake a stump for a man than a man for a stump. That's how our kind survived. 11 snags on a ridge, catching the last light, and a lonely man's mind dressing them up into a crowd. I made myself believe it, near enough, and I finished my coffee, and I climbed down and went to bed. But I counted them again the next evening. You can't not, once the thought's in you. And there were 12. I want to be careful telling this, because I know how it sounds, and I spent a long time up there being careful with myself, testing it, not letting myself run to the easy fright. So understand that I counted them many evenings before I let myself accept what the counting told me. 11 the first night, 12 the second. The night after that, 9. Then 11 again, then 14. The number changed, night to night, and rocks do not change their number. Snags do not come and go along a ridge from one dusk to the next. Whatever stood along that crest facing my tower was a different number of somethings every evening, which meant they were not fixed to the ground, which meant that in the hours between one dusk and the next, some of them left, and others came, or the same ones came and went, gathering at that hour to stand along the ridge and face the one lit window on the mountain. And they were not always on the far ridge. That was the next thing I couldn't put down. Some evenings they were, where I'd first seen them, a mile off on the crest across the gap. But some evenings they were nearer, down off the far crest, and onto the near slope of the gap, closer, still spaced out in their loose line, still upright, still facing me, still perfectly and terribly still. They never moved while I watched. That was a thing I made certain of. I'd fix on one through the glass and hold on it for as long as I could stand, and it never so much as shifted its weight. And yet, if I looked away and looked back, it might be that they'd all gained a little ground, come a little way down the slope toward me, the way the hour hand of a clock is never moving when you look at it, and is always somewhere new when you look again. A silent congregation is how I came to think of them, gathering at dusk out of the timber, and the failing light to stand and watch the tower. and drawing in, night by night, slow, toward the mountain where the one warm window was. It was days into this, days of not sleeping right and not admitting to myself why, that I found the note. I'd been going back through the logbooks, the record the caretakers kept, the daily entries of weather and readings and maintenance. Partly out of boredom, and partly because I'd started to wonder whether the man I'd relieved, whom I'd never met. The job had been arranged through the district office, had left any word of what I was seeing, and buried in his last weeks of entries, in among the barometer readings and the rainfall totals, wedged at the bottom of a page, like a thing set down, and then half taken back, there was one line in a different, harder press of the pen than the rest. It said, "Don't count them out loud." That was all. No explanation. Nothing before it or after it, just that one line sitting there in the log among the ordinary numbers. And I sat in that cabin and read it over and over, and felt the cold come up in me. Because it told me two things at once. It told me the man before me had seen them too, that they were real enough and old enough to be a thing a caretaker knew about, and warned the next one of. And it told me there was a rule. A thing you did not do. And I did not understand the rule, could not fathom what it could mean, or why it should matter, whether you counted them silent in your head or out loud into the air. But I understood that a man had felt it was the single most important thing to pass on, more important than any reading in that book. And I resolved that whatever else I did up on that mountain, I would keep his rule. And I did. For weeks I did. I counted them because I couldn't stop myself counting them, but I counted them the way you'd count anything you were afraid of. Silent, behind my teeth, the number forming only in my head. And they came on. Slow, patient, never while I watched, a few closer every dusk, down the near slope now and into the gap itself, so that the mile of open air that had been between us thinned and thinned. I stopped being able to pretend they were snags. Up close in the glass, now I could see they stood like people, the set of the shoulders, the hang of the arms. But where a face should be, there was nothing, just a smooth, dark blank turned up toward my lit window. And there were, some nights, so many of them, spread across the whole slope facing me, a hillside of standing watchers, all fixed on the one light on the mountain, and I would climb down from the cab, with my heart going and go into the cabin, and not look out again till morning, when they were always gone, the ridge and the slope empty and innocent in the daylight, nothing there at all. 3 nights ago I forgot. I don't know how to explain the forgetting except that I was tired, worn down to the nub by weeks of that, by the not sleeping and the dusk dread and the awful patience of them. And I was standing at the glass in the failing light, and they were close, closer than they'd ever been, down off the slope and coming up the last of the bald, toward the foot of the tower itself. A great silent crowd of them gathered up, near now, faces of blank dark all tilted up at me, and I did the thing I'd done 100 times, counted them. Only this time in my exhaustion, the count came up out of me the way it does, when you're tired and stop minding yourself, up out of my throat and past my teeth and into the air, a low breath of a whisper, but out loud, 1, 2, 3. My lips moving, my voice the barest thread of sound in that quiet cab, but a voice, counting them up the slope, and I didn't even catch myself doing it. Went right up the line of them, and there were 16, and I breathed the number 16 out loud into the glass, and the nearest one moved. It was close, that one, closest of all, come up to the very foot of the tower now, right down at the bottom of the steel below me. And when I breathed that last number, when I counted it out loud into the air, it raised its head. Slow, the only movement any of them had ever made in all those weeks of watching. And it was that one, the nearest, tilting its blank dark face up the height of the tower toward the lit cab where I stood, and there was, in the slowness of it, in the deliberate lift of that faceless head, at the sound of my voice, something I can only call gladness, recognition, as if it had waited a very long time. All of them had gathered and patient at every dusk for one thing and one thing only, to be counted out loud, to have their number spoken into the air by the warm living voice in the lit window. To be called, and I had done it at last. In my tiredness, I had finally done the one thing the man before me had begged the next man not to do, and the nearest of them lifted its head to me in the dusk, like a thing that has finally, after long waiting, heard its name. I came down off that mountain that night. I didn't wait for morning, and I didn't finish out my time. And I didn't much care what the district office thought. I drove that washed-out service road in the black dark, with my hands white on the wheel, and I did not look at the ridges, and I have not gone back, and I will not go back. I left the logbook up there, my weeks of readings, and, at the bottom of my last page, in a hard press of the pen, one line for whoever relieves me, the same line that was left for me, the only thing worth passing on. But I've come to understand, in the time since, that the note doesn't save you. It didn't save me, and I don't think it saved the man before me, because a rule you don't understand is a rule you'll break, sooner or later. Worn down and tired on a lonely mountain at dusk. And I lie awake now, far from those mountains, in a town full of people and light. And I think about the one of them that raised its head. It heard its number. It knows me now. And I count without wanting to. In the dark before sleep, I catch myself counting. The street lights, the cars, the beats of my own heart. And every time I do, I have to clamp my teeth on it and hold the number behind them. Because I got a good look, that last night, at how glad it was to be counted. And I am so afraid, some tired night, of counting out loud again, and looking up, and finding that the far ridge was never really a mile away at all. 4 of us went up to Backpack, a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail, through the Rhone Highlands. The summer after we all turned 30, an old college crowd, trying to hold on to something before jobs and marriages scattered us for good. We were experienced enough, all of us, no strangers to the woods, and we'd planned it right, going in for 4 days, across some of the loneliest and most beautiful country in the whole Appalachian chain, the high grassy balds up on Rhone, where you walk for miles above the tree line, with the world falling away blue on every side. It was the kind of trip you plan for months and remember for years, and we do remember it, all 4 of us, though not for any of the reasons we'd hoped. We've talked about it exactly once since, all of us together, and we couldn't agree on what happened, and we haven't spoken of it again. The first day was everything we'd wanted. Hard climbing, big country, the balds opening up under a huge sky, and we made good miles and we were happy, loose and laughing, the way you get when the phones don't work and the world's been left at the bottom of the mountain. Our plan for the first night was to push past the last trail shelter and camp deep, out in the remote country, beyond where the day hikers and the shelter crowd stopped, to get a night truly alone, up high. We found a flat spot to camp in the late afternoon, off the trail in a little grassy gap ringed by wind-stunted trees, no shelter for miles behind us, and none ahead the nearest road a full hard day's walk in any direction. Exactly what we'd come for. We set our tents, and we gathered wood, and we built a good fire as the light started to go, and that's when I first felt the country change. Though I didn't say anything, because how do you say a thing like that? It started with the sound going out of the woods. Up in that high country at dusk, there's a whole chorus that comes up as the day birds quit. The wood thrush with that long liquid call, the peepers down in the wet places, the first owls, the small stirrings of things starting their night. It comes up every evening in the mountains, that shift change of sound, and you stop noticing it because it's always there. What you notice is when it stops, and that first night, as the dark came down, it stopped. Not all at once, but in a spreading quiet, the thrushes going still, and then the insects, and then everything. A silence that came in from the edges of our little gap and closed over us until there was nothing at all but the pop of our own fire, and the four of us, and the enormous listening dark. We got quieter without meaning to, you do. When the woods go silent, the animal in you goes still and listens too, because the woods only go that silent when something is moving through them that everything else is afraid of. It was Danny who saw the eye shine first. We were sitting around the fire not talking much anymore, and he went quiet in a different way, and then said low, "Hey, look," and nodded out past the edge of the firelight. And there, low to the ground, right at the ragged boundary where our light gave out and the dark began, were 2 points of light. Eyeshine, that flat coin glow you get when a fire catches an animal's eyes out in the night, throwing the light back at you. We all saw it, and we did the reasonable thing, the thing you do. We laughed, a little too quick, and somebody said deer, and somebody else said coon, or maybe a fox, and we told each other it was just some critter drawn in by the fire, and our food smell. Curious. Nothing to it. The woods are full of eyes at night. And we turned back to the fire, but it didn't behave like an animal. That's the thing that took the laugh out of us, slow, over the next hour. A deer looks and bolts. A coon or a fox, caught in the light, moves off about its business. This didn't move off. It stayed. Those 2 low points of light held there, at the edge of the dark, steady, watching, and when I made myself look at them straight on, they didn't waver, or blink out the way an animal's do when it decides to leave. They just held. And then, after a while, they weren't where they'd been. They'd moved. Not toward us, not away, but around along the edge of the light, to a new place at the boundary of the dark, and settled again and watched. And a while after that, moved again. It was circling us. Slow, patient, keeping always to that exact line where the firelight failed. Never a foot into the light, and never far out into the dark. Pacing a wide, slow circle around our camp, and every time one of us happened to turn his head, it was in a new spot, low. Those 2 flat eyes, catching the fire facing in, facing us. We stopped pretending pretty quick after that. Somebody threw more wood on and built the fire up big. A real blaze, pushing the ring of light out wider, and the eyes drew back. But only as far as they had to. Only to the new edge of the light, the new boundary, and no farther. We doubled the size of our fire, and all it bought us was a bigger circle for the thing to walk, and walk it did, round and round, that low, patient shape, pacing the perimeter of our light just past, where we could see anything of it but the eyes. And it came to me, sitting there, that it was keeping to the dark on purpose, that it could have come closer and chose not to, that it wanted to stay exactly at the line where we could know it was there, but couldn't see what it was, and that this was somehow worse than if it had rushed us. Because a thing that rushes you is an animal doing what animals do, and a thing that paces the edge of your light all night, deliberate, patient, staying just out of sight. That's a thing with a mind and a purpose, and it's in no hurry. None of us slept. There was never any question of it. We didn't even go to the tents. We sat with our backs to the fire, and to each other, the 4 of us facing out in 4 directions, so that between us we could see the whole ring of the dark, and we fed that fire all night long, and we watched the eyes go round. Sometimes it was on my side, those 2 low lights sliding slow through the black at the edge of my vision, and I'd say it's on me, and the others would tense, and then it would move on, and Danny would say, "It's on me now," and so on, around and around, all night, this thing pacing us while we sat there, feeding wood into a fire, with hands that weren't steady. We talked some, low, to keep our nerve up, and we talked about what it could be. A bear, we said, though it moved wrong for a bear and was too low. A big cat, a mountain lion, though they're not supposed to be up there anymore. And a cat wouldn't pace like that for hours. A person, we said, some hermit or lunatic. And that was the worst thought, and we let it drop. The truth is none of the things we named fit what we were all feeling, which was that whatever walked our perimeter, that night was patient, in a way that nothing right is patient, and that it was waiting, and that we did not know what for. It never came into the light, not once, all night, and it never left. Those are the two things all four of us agree on, the only two things, and they're the things I can't get past even now. It didn't tire and wander off the way an animal's curiosity fails. It didn't work up its nerve and rush us the way a predator would. It simply held its patient circle at the edge of our fire from full dark until the sky finally started to gray in the east. Hour after hour after hour, watching us, pacing us, waiting, and as the light came up at last, the eyes drew back and thinned and were gone, and the sound came back into the woods, the birds starting up like nothing had happened, and we sat there, wrung out and gray-faced in the dawn, hardly able to believe we'd made it to it. And then, when it was full light, and we'd got our legs back under us, we found the prints. They were all around the camp, in a ring, just past where the edge of the firelight would have been. The ground in that gap was soft, a little damp, grassy and bare in patches, and worn into it, all the way around our campsite, was a circle. A complete circle, unbroken, going all the way around where we'd sat, hundreds and hundreds of footsteps overlaid one on the other, the track of something that had walked that same circle around us, over and over and over through the whole night. So many times it had worn a path into the ground. We stood inside that ring in the morning light and looked at it, and none of us said anything for a long time, because we'd known it was pacing us, but seeing it written in the ground like that, seeing how many times it had gone around, how patient and how tireless and how close, was a different and worse kind of knowing. And they were not an animal's prints. That's the part that ended any argument, that put the cold in us that hasn't fully left. They were feet, bare human feet, the heel and the ball in the toes plain, in the soft ground, unmistakable, the print of a barefoot person walking, but they were wrong. They were too long, longer than a foot ought to be, narrow and long, and the toes were wrong, and the stride of them, when you followed the circle around, was wrong, too even, too smooth, the pace of something that had walked that ring all night without once breaking rhythm, without once stopping, without once stumbling in the dark, barefoot, all night, in that cold high country, over that rough ground, round and round a fire it never entered, watching four men it never touched. We didn't say much. We broke camp faster than we'd ever broken camp in our lives, and we hiked out, and we cut the trip short by 2 days, and nobody argued, and we came down off that mountain and went back to our lives. We talked about it one time, a good while after, all four of us together, trying to make it into something we could hold. And we couldn't agree. And that's maybe the thing that haunts me most, more than the eyes, or the silence, or the ring worn in the ground. Because the question we couldn't answer, the question we still can't, is why. Why it waited, what it was waiting for. It paced the edge of our light all night, close, patient, tireless, and it never came in, and it never left. And a thing doesn't do that for nothing. Danny thought it was kept out by the fire, that it wanted in, and the light was all that held it, and that it walked the circle looking for a gap. a place where the fire had died down enough to cross, and that we saved ourselves without knowing it by never letting the fire fail. But I've never been sure that's right, because it could have rushed us any of 100 times in the dark hours and didn't, and a thing that wants in and is only kept out by fire doesn't wait so patient and so calm. I've come to think it wasn't waiting to come in at all. I've come to think it was waiting for one of us to come out, to do the thing a tired, frightened man does at the edge of a long night, to get up and step out past the fire to relieve himself, or gather wood, or just to look, to cross that line out of the light on his own 2 feet into the dark where it walked. I think it walked that ring all night, the way a patient thing walks the edge of a trap it has already set, in no hurry, certain, waiting for the light to fail, or the nerve to fail, or the bladder to fail, waiting for one of us to step over the line and out of the circle on our own. And I think the only reason all 4 of us came down off that mountain is that not one of us, all that long night, was fool enough or brave enough to stand up and walk out past the fire. And I think it is still up there in that high, lonely country, walking the edge of somebody's light, patient as ever, waiting. I bought a house in an old coal camp in McDowell County, because it was all I could afford, and because at that point in my life, cheap and quiet were the only 2 things I was after. It was one of a long row of company houses, strung along a single road up a narrow hollow, the kind of place they threw up by the hundreds a century ago to house the men who worked the mines, identical little frame houses, set close together, facing each other across the road, built fast and cheap by the company, and sold or rented to the miners who spent their lives underground and their wages at the company store. Most of them were empty now. The mine had closed 40 years back, and the camp had died slow after. The young people leaving, the old people dying, house after house, going dark and empty until the whole hollow was mostly ghosts, a few of us, scattered living folk, holding on among a long row of hollow houses, with the mountains standing up steep and close on both sides, shutting out the light. My house was sound enough, and I set about making it livable, and for the first few days I was too busy to feel much of anything but tired. It was in the first week, once I'd slowed down enough to notice my surroundings, that I began to feel the eyes. They came from the house across the road. Directly across from mine stood one of the empty ones, dark and gutted, the porch sagging, the windows all gone to black empty holes, with not a pane of glass left in them, a dead house like a dozen others in that hollow. But from the first, there was something about it, a sense, whenever I was out in my yard or on my porch, of being watched from over there. And not from the house in general, but from one particular window, an upstairs window, on the left, a black square up under the eave, where I always felt, without ever quite seeing, that someone was standing back in the shadow of the room, looking out. Looking at me. I'd catch it from the corner of my eye. That's how it always came. At the edge of sight, the sense of a figure at that window. And I'd turn my head to look straight at it. And there'd be nothing, of course, only the black empty square of a glassless window in an abandoned house. Nothing there. Nothing that could be there. But the feeling didn't go when I looked. That was the thing I couldn't get comfortable with, ordinarily. When you catch a movement at the corner of your eye and turn and see it's nothing, the feeling releases, your mind lets go of it. This didn't let go. I'd look right at that empty window and see nothing, and still feel, as strong as ever, that I was being watched from it, that whatever stood back in the dark of that room was still there, still looking, only that it couldn't be caught by looking straight on. And it was worst at dusk. In the daytime, I could mostly talk myself out of it. But as the light went, as that early mountain dusk came down into the hollow, where the ridges took the sun long before it set. The feeling would sharpen and grow, and I'll swear it to you now, that the darkness inside that one window was a different darkness than the dark around it. Deeper, thicker, gathered, as if the ordinary shadow of an empty room had something standing in it, filling it, a denser black in the shape of a man at the glassless window, and it would watch my house through that failing light with a particular attention I could feel on my skin like a draft. My house was one of the few with lights on in that whole dead row, one of the few warm lit windows in all that dark hollow, and I came to feel that the thing in the window across the road watched my lit house the way you'd watch the last warm thing on a cold and empty street. Fixed, hungry almost, patient. I might have gone on like that indefinitely, half spooked and half talking myself out of it, if not for the old woman. She was one of the last of the old camp people, lived a few houses down, had grown up in that hollow when the mine was working, and the camp was full and never left. And she took an interest in me the way the old will take an interest in someone new, brought me a jar of beans, sat on my porch a while. And I don't know what made me ask her, except that I couldn't carry it alone anymore. But I nodded across the road at the empty house and asked her, light as I could, did she know who used to live there? And she looked at the house, and then she looked at me, and her face got careful. She told me that house had belonged to a foreman. A mine foreman, back in the working days, a company man, and, by her account, a hard one. She said he'd been the kind of foreman the company kept, because he'd get the coal out of the men whatever it cost them, that he was feared and hated up and down the camp, and that he'd been the company's eyes on the hollow, especially in the bad times. And there'd been bad times. The strikes, she said, the years when the men tried to organize and the company fought them, and it got ugly. The way got ugly all through those coal fields, men beaten and blacklisted and worse. And during the strikes, she said, that foreman had sat at his upstairs window. The one on the left, up under the eave. He'd sit up there hour on hour watching the road, watching the hollow, watching who came and went, who gathered with who talked to the union men, marking it all. And the men in that camp had learned to feel his eyes on them and to fear them. Because the ones the foreman watched, she said, the ones he fixed on, the ones he gave a good long look from that window, those were the ones something happened to. A roof fall, a slate come down, a rope that parted, or a car that jumped the track. Accidents, all of them, down in the dark of the mine where accidents happened all the time. But it was always the ones he'd watched. And then she told me the part that has kept me up since. She said he'd never stop, that the foreman had died, long ago, in that house, an old hated man, but that folks in the camp had always known, in the way the old camps knew things, that he was still up there at his window, still watching the road, still marking who came and went in the hollow, and that the rule, the thing every child in that camp had been taught, was that you did not go out after dark in front of that window. You didn't stand in the road there in the failing light. You didn't let him get a good long look at you. Because the ones he watched too long still tended to have accidents, even after the mine closed, even now, and it didn't do to give the watcher in the window a good long look at your face. She said all this plain, not like she was trying to scare me, more like she was passing on something she thought I'd better know. Living where I lived, right across from that window. And then she patted my hand and gathered herself up and went on home before the light got low. And I noticed she kept to the far side of the road going, the side away from the empty house, and she did not once look up at the window. I'd like to say I laughed it off. I didn't, quite, But I told myself it was the kind of story an old camp grows, around a dead house and a hated man, that a hard foreman and a run of mine accidents were plenty to breed a legend without anything unnatural in it. But I found myself keeping the rule anyway. I found I did not go out in my front yard at dusk anymore. I found that when I had to cross the road after dark, I kept to my own side, quick, my eyes down, not looking up at that black square under the eave, feeling it on me the whole way. And I told myself I was just being neighborly to an old woman's story, humoring it. But the truth is, the feeling had never needed her story to be real. Her story only gave a shape to a thing I'd felt in my skin since the first week. It's the neighbors that I can't explain away. That's the thing that's made me write this down. Since I moved into that hollow, 3 of the few living neighbors I had have died. 3, in not much more than a year, in a row of houses that hardly had a dozen living souls left in it. And I know that old people die, and it was a hollow full of old people. And a run of deaths in a dying camp is the most natural thing there is. I know that. But here is what I can't get around, what I noticed only after the 3rd one, and then couldn't stop noticing. Every one of the 3, at one time or another, I had seen standing out in the road, in front of that house, in the failing light of dusk. I could picture each of them, plain. Old Mr. Coleman stopped in the road one evening to talk to me, standing right in front of the empty house with the light going, his back to that window while we chatted. The Hurley woman, out after dark in the road looking for her cat, right there below the window, calling and calling. The 3rd one, the old man from the end of the row, I'd seen him stand a long while, one dusk in that very spot, just standing, looking up the hollow, letting the light go, right in front of that black square under the eave. Each of them I'd seen give the watcher a good long look, and each of them, within a season or 2, was dead. Heart, they said, or a fall, or just old age, ordinary things. Accidents of the body, the way the mine deaths had been accidents of the slate. But it was always the ones he'd watched. I still live in that house. I don't rightly know why I stay, except that I've got nowhere else to go, and it's still cheap and quiet, God knows quiet. But I keep the rule now. Keep it careful, the way the old woman taught me, and the way every soul in that camp used to keep it. I don't go out front at dusk. I don't stand in the road. I keep my curtains drawn on that side after dark, and I don't look at the window under the eave. And I have gotten to where I can almost not feel the eyes, almost, if I keep my mind off them. But the old woman down the row passed this winter, quiet, in her sleep, they said. And now there's hardly anyone left, living in the whole hollow but me. And lately, these last few weeks, the feeling has changed. And it's this change that has the fear back in me cold, because the watching doesn't seem to come only from across the road anymore. At dusk now, drawing my curtains, I feel it from closer, from my own side of the road, from my own yard, some evenings, and last night. At that failing hour, I felt it from inside my own house, from the dark at the top of my own stairs. And I understand now, too late, what I think the old woman was really trying to tell me, that the watcher doesn't stay at his window forever. That a hollow empties out, one marked neighbor at a time, until there's only one warm lit house left, only one face left in all that dark for him to watch. And that when there's no one else left in the road to look at, the watcher finally comes down off his window and crosses to the last light to get a good long look at the one who's left. I managed the land for a hunting club up in Graham County, a few thousand acres of hard mountain timber, the members lease for the deer and the bear and the turkey. And part of my job, the part I always like best, is running the trail cameras. Over the years, I built up a whole network of them across the lease, better than 30 cameras strapped to trees along the trails, and the field edges, and the creek crossings, the cellular kind mostly, that send the pictures to my phone, and the older kind, back in the deep country where there's no signal, that store their pictures on a card I have to walk in and pull. It's how you learn a piece of hunting ground, how you know your deer before the season, which bucks are working, which ridges, what's moving where and when. I've got 20 years of pictures off that land. I know that country, through those cameras, better than most men know their own backyards. So when I tell you what started showing up on them this past season, understand it comes from a man who has looked at more trail camera pictures than just about anybody alive, and knows exactly what belongs in that country at night and what doesn't. It was going through the cards in the fall that I first caught one. I was at the cabin one evening, scrolling through a week's worth of pictures, off one of the deep country cameras, the no-signal kind, just clicking through the usual. Does and fawns, a couple of good bucks, a bear, the wind tripping the sensor, all the ordinary traffic of the night woods. And then a frame stopped my thumb. It was a night picture. The infrared flash throwing everything into that flat gray and black, and at the very back of the frame, right at the edge, where the flash gave out into the dark, there was a figure, a person, standing, tall, dark, upright at the far edge of the light and turned toward the camera, facing the lens. Not walking through, not caught mid-stride the way you catch a person who's wandered past. Standing, still, square to the camera, facing it dead on. My first thought was a trespasser, a poacher, somebody slipping around the lease at night, and that was bad enough. But something about the picture didn't sit right even then, and it took me a moment to place it. It was the frames around it. Trail cameras fire in bursts, and they fire on motion, so a person walking past leaves you a sequence, coming into frame, crossing, leaving. But the frame before this one, a minute earlier, showed empty woods. And the frame after, a minute later, showed empty woods. Just the one picture with the figure in it, standing there facing the camera, and nothing before and nothing after, as if it had not walked into that spot and had not walked out of it, as if it had simply been there for one frame and then not. A man walking triggers the camera walking. This hadn't triggered anything walking. It was only ever there, standing in the single frame and gone. I told myself the sensible things. A glitch, a trick of the flash, a snag, or a stump the infrared had dressed up into a man. But I'd looked at 20 years of these pictures, and I knew a stump from a standing man. And this was a standing man, or the shape of one, tall and dark and deliberate, facing me down the lens. I flagged it as odd, and I kept scrolling, and I tried to let it go. Then it was on another camera. A different part of the lease entirely, miles off, the next card I pulled. A figure, at night, at the back of the frame standing, facing the lens. Same as before. One frame, empty woods on either side. And then another camera, and another. Over the following couple of weeks, as I made my rounds pulling cards, and watching the cellular feeds come in, they started showing up all across the property. Always at night. Always at the very edge of the flash, at the back of the frame, tall and dark. Always standing, still, and always, this is the thing that got into me, facing the camera. Turned square toward the lens, every time, as if each one knew exactly where the camera was hidden on its tree, and had positioned itself deliberately to face it, to be seen by it. You don't get that from deer that never once look at the camera or look at it by accident. These looked at it every time, on purpose, like being seen was the point, and never once did I catch one moving. That became the thing I couldn't get past, the thing I checked and rechecked. In 20 years of pictures, I've got animals doing everything. Walking, running, fighting, feeding, the whole burst of a creature moving through the frame. But these figures never walked, never arrived, never left, never crossed. Every single appearance was one still frame, a figure standing and facing the lens, with empty woods in the frames before and after. They did not travel through my cameras. They appeared in them, one at a time, chose to be in one frame, and were gone. I did what I do with any pattern on that land. I mapped it. I've got a map of the lease with every camera location marked, and I started putting a pin in every spot one of the figures showed up, with the date. And when I stood back and looked at the map with all the pins in it, I felt the bottom go out of my stomach because it wasn't random. The pins made a shape. They made a ring, a wide, rough circle of camera locations all around the outer edges of the property, where the figures had first started appearing. And then, as I looked at the dates, I saw that the ring was closing. Night by night, card by card, the figures were showing up on cameras a little farther in. Not on the outer ring anymore, but on the cameras inside it. And then the ones inside those, the appearances marching slowly inward from the edges of the lease toward the center. And at the center of that map, at the very middle of the closing ring, was the old hunting cabin, where I stay, where I was standing, looking at the map, with my phone in my hand. I want to tell you I left then. I didn't. A man tells himself he's being foolish, that he's built a spook story out of glitchy pictures, and a mind gone lonesome from too many nights alone in a cabin in the deep woods, and I told myself all of that. But I kept mapping, because I had to know, and the figures kept coming, and the ring kept closing, drawing in toward the center night after night, with a patience and a steadiness that no glitch and no trespasser and no animal has. They were working inward, toward the cabin, toward me. And there was nothing random or accidental in it, and the more I watched it, the more certain I became of a thing I did not want to be certain of, which was that they wanted me to be watching. That every one of those pictures, every figure standing square to a hidden camera at the edge of the flash, facing the lens, had been posed. Deliberate, that they knew where every camera was, and knew I'd see the pictures, and were letting themselves be caught, one careful frame at a time, so that I would sit in my cabin night after night and watch them come. The cameras weren't catching them by accident. Nothing about it was accident. It was a message, spelled out one frame at a time across my own network. And the message was, we are coming in and we want you to see. Last week they showed up on the two cameras nearest the cabin. One on each side of it, the two closest cameras I've got, maybe 100 yards out on either hand. Both the same night, and these pictures were close. Not figures at the far edge of the flash anymore, but figures well up in the frame. Near, close enough that the infrared lit them better than it ever had, and I could see them plainer than I'd wanted to. Tall and thin and dark and wrong, in a way I still can't put words to, the proportions of them not quite a man's, and their faces. I could see their faces now, close as they were, turned square to the lens, turned toward the camera. Turned, I swear before God, toward me through the camera, out of the picture, meeting my eyes on the little screen in my hand as I sat in the cabin between the two of them, in the dark. One on each side, facing in, facing me. There is one camera left, one camera between those two and the cabin, set on the trail that comes up to the clearing where the cabin sits. The last one, the innermost pin on my map. And every morning now I check it first thing, before coffee, before anything. My thumb not quite steady, my heart up in my throat, because I know what's coming. I know it the way you know a thing is coming, when you've watched it come, patient and steady and sure, all across a map, all season long. The ring has closed to that last camera. Whatever's been walking it inward, one deliberate frame at a time, showing me each step so I'd be watching, is one camera, from the cabin now, and when it appears on that last one, it will be at the edge of my clearing, in the open, 100 feet from the door, where I sit checking my phone in the dark. And here is the thing I have finally understood. The thing that keeps me sitting up at night with the lamp on and the rifle across my knees, that I know in my heart will not matter. I used to think trail cameras caught the secret life of the woods by accident, that the animals never knew they were seen. But these were never caught by accident. They showed themselves to me on purpose, patient, one frame at a time, from the outer edge of the lease all the way in to my door. And there is only one reason a thing does that. It wasn't hunting me in secret. It wanted me to watch it come. It wanted me to sit here in this cabin, at the center of the ring, night after night, and see it close the distance, and understand, and wait, and be afraid. Because the fear is part of it, the watching is part of it. The long, slow, certain coming is the whole point. I check that last camera every morning now. It's still empty, the trail up to the clearing, empty gray woods in the flash. But I know I'll open my phone one of these mornings and it won't be empty. And there'll be a figure on it, close, tall, and dark, and facing the lens, standing at the edge of my clearing in the night, turned toward the cabin, toward me, and I know that will be the last picture, because after that, there won't be any more woods between us for a camera to stand in, and the only place left for it to show itself will be the doorway. My grandmother's place sat on one side of a narrow holler. Up in Watauga County, a little farmhouse on a bench of ground above the branch, and directly across from it, on the far side of that narrow gap, sat the old Sizemore homestead. The holler was tight there. The two houses, maybe a few hundred yards apart, across the little valley, with the branch running in the bottom between them, close enough that from my grandmother's porch you could look right across and see the Sizemore porch plain, see the whole face of that house looking back at you across the air. The Sizemore place had been empty my whole life, long abandoned, gone gray and hollow, the way those old homesteads do. And I spent every summer of my boyhood at my grandmother's, and I grew up with that dead house across the holler, the way you grow up with any feature of a place, the way you grow up with a particular mountain or a particular bend in a road. It was just there, until the evening my grandmother taught me the rule. I was young, and it was dusk, and I must have been staring off across the holler at the Sizemore house, the idle way a child stares at things, and my grandmother took me by the shoulder. Not rough, but firm. Firm enough that I still remember the grip of it, and she turned me away from it. And she told me, in a voice she didn't use for ordinary things, that I was never to look at the Sizemore porch after dark, never to look at it long, and never after the light was going. I asked her why, the way a child does, and she didn't spin me a story, didn't tell me a ghost lived there, or any of the things you'd tell a child to scare it off a danger. She just said, quiet and certain, because somebody watches back. And she said it in a way that closed the subject. And she made me come in off the porch, and I carried that rule the rest of that summer, and every summer after. The way you carry a thing an adult tells you in that particular voice, half not believing it, and half never once willing to test it. She's been gone a long time now, my grandmother, and the place came down to me, and I was a grown man when I inherited it, a grown man with a grown man's certainties, and I'll be honest and tell you that I laughed at the rule. Not unkindly, I remembered it fondly. The way you remember the harmless superstitions of the people who raised you, an old woman's way of keeping a wandering boy close to the porch after dark, by peopling the empty house across the way with a watcher. I moved into the place, meaning to fix it up and live in it, and I thought of the rule as a piece of my grandmother, I'd inherited along with the house, a warm, foolish thing, and I paid it no mind at all. The first warm evening I was there, I sat out on the porch as the sun went down behind the ridge, and I looked across the holler at the Sizemore house, deliberately, the way you press on a sore tooth, half remembering the old rule and half meaning to prove to myself how foolish it was. The dusk was coming down blue into the holler, the light draining off, and I looked across at the dark, hollow face of that abandoned house, at its sagging porch going to shadow. And there was a figure on the porch, sitting. In a chair on the Sizemore porch, a pale, still shape in the failing light. And it was facing my house, facing me. I could not make out a face or any detail across that gap in the dusk, just the pale shape of it, upright in a chair, turned toward my porch across the narrow holler. And my first thought was some ordinary thing. A squatter, a hiker, a neighbor I didn't know about resting on an empty porch. But it didn't move, and it didn't have the feeling of a person resting. And as I looked at it, the old rule came back to me cold, all at once, because as I looked, I began to feel the looking go both ways. That's the only way I know to say it. It wasn't that I was looking at a thing across the holler. It was that a thing across the holler was looking back at me, that the looking traveled both directions across that gap of air. And the longer I held my eyes on it, the stronger that feeling grew, until I felt something reach across the holler, across those few hundred yards of dusk, and take hold of me, fix on me. And here is the part that put the real fear in me, the part that made a believer of a grown man who'd laughed at his grandmother's tale. It was hard to look away, terribly hard. I sat there with my eyes locked across the holler on that pale, still shape, and I found that pulling my gaze off it was like pulling against a weight, like the looking had become a thing with substance. A line drawn taut between me and it across the valley, and it did not want to be broken. I had to make myself do it. I had to force my eyes down to my own hands in my lap, and my heart was going. And when I finally looked up again, it was full dark. And I could see nothing across the holler at all, only the black shape of the Sizemore house against the last gray of the sky. I kept the rule after that. God help me. I understood it now, from the inside, the way my grandmother must have understood it, and I kept it. In the evenings, as the light went, I kept my eyes down. I learned to sit on my porch without ever letting my gaze drift across the holler to that house. Learned to feel the pull of it and refuse it. Learned to go inside before the dusk got deep. And I came to understand what my grandmother had really been doing all those years. The thing she couldn't quite say to a child. She hadn't been keeping me from looking at it. Looking at it was nothing in itself. She'd been keeping it from getting a good long look at me, because the danger wasn't in my seeing it. The danger was in it seeing me, in it fixing on me across the holler, the way it had started to fix on me that first evening, and she had spent all those summers making sure it never got the chance to settle its attention on her grandson, turning me away from that porch before the looking could go both ways and take hold. I might have gone on like that, keeping the rule, living alongside the thing on the porch, the way my grandmother had, the way I expect her people had before her. But I'd already broken it, that first evening before I knew. I'd already sat there and looked long and let the looking go both ways and let it take hold. And it had fixed on me. And once it fixes on you, keeping your eyes down after doesn't undo it. It only slows it, because it's not content on its porch anymore. I first noticed a few weeks in. I was careful never to look across the holler after dark now, but a man can't help what he sees at the edges. And one evening, bringing in wood at dusk, I caught the pale shape without meaning to, and it wasn't on the Sizemore porch. It was in the yard, down off the porch, out in the grown-over yard of the Sizemore place, still sitting or standing. I couldn't tell, but nearer the holler than it had been, nearer to my side. And I told myself I'd misjudged, that dusk plays tricks, and I kept my eyes down harder than ever. But it went on, night by night, in the glimpses I couldn't keep myself from catching. The pale shape was farther down, off the Sizemore porch, then down the slope of their side of the holler, then. And this is when the cold really settled into me and hasn't left. Down in the bottom. Down where the branch runs, in the very bottom of the holler between the two houses. The pale, still shape standing near the water now in the dusk, facing up the slope, at my house, at my porch, at me. It had come down off its side and crossed the bottom, and there was only my side of the holler left for it to climb. I understand it all now. The whole shape of the thing my grandmother spent those summers protecting me from. And understanding it is its own kind of horror. Because there's nothing to be done with the understanding. The ones it fixes on, it comes across the holler for. Slow, over a long time. Patient as the dark itself. It sat on that porch across the holler, for who knows how many years, generations maybe, watching my grandmother's house. And my grandmother knew that as long as no one let it get a good long look at them, as long as no one let the looking go both ways and gave it someone to fix on, it stayed on its porch, watching, waiting, content across the gap. And she kept her people safe from it, not by any charm or any prayer, but by the one simple thing, by never letting it lock its attention on a living soul, by turning a wandering boy away from that porch at dusk 100 times, so that it never once got to fix on him. She held it across the holler, with nothing but a rule, all those years. And the first warm evening I was there, a grown man who knew better, I undid all her care in a single idle minute, and let it look at me, and now it's coming, the way it comes, slow across the holler over the nights and the weeks, and there's no rule left that will send it back. I keep my eyes down still, every evening. I don't look at it, don't feed the taut line of the looking, and maybe that's why it's slow. Maybe not looking back is the only thing keeping it to a crawl instead of a rush. But it doesn't need me to look anymore. It already got its good long look that first night, and it fixed on me. And now it only comes, patient and certain, a little farther up my side of the holler every dusk. Last night, bringing in the wood, I caught it without meaning to, at the edge of my sight. And it was out of the bottom now, up onto my slope, in the lower field below the house, the pale, still shape standing in the dark grass facing my porch. Close enough now that on some coming night I know I'll be able to make out, at last, whatever it is that's under that pale stillness, and I don't want to. There's not much holler left between us. And I find myself thinking about my grandmother, who kept me safe from this my whole boyhood, and never told me the whole of it. And I think I finally understand her silence too, because what could she have said? She couldn't have told a child that the empty house across the holler held something that would spend years crossing to you once it had your face. She could only take me by the shoulder in the dusk and turn me gently away and hope I never asked too much and hope I'd keep the rule after she was gone. And I didn't, and now the holler grows narrower every night, and I keep my eyes down, and I wait. And I understand that keeping your eyes down was never a way to make it stop. It was only ever a way to keep from having to watch it come. I rented a cabin off the grid in Yancey County. The winter, I decided I was finally going to finish the book I'd been failing to write for 3 years. And I want to say plainly, before I tell you the rest, that I went up there whole. I was not a haunted man. I did not believe in ghosts or spirits or anything I couldn't put my hands on. I was a tired man with an unfinished manuscript and a theory that what I needed was silence and solitude. No internet, and no neighbors, and nothing to do but write, and I found a place that offered exactly that. A one-room cabin deep in the mountains at the end of a long dirt track. No power but a generator, no water but a hand pump, no soul for miles in any direction. I took it for 2 months. I thought the isolation would be the hard part. I never once imagined the isolation would turn out to be the least of what was up there with me. It was a plain little cabin, one room, a wood stove, and a bed, and not much else. And I set myself up the first afternoon, hauled in my boxes, arranged a desk under the window where the light was good, and felt that clean, hopeful feeling you get starting something. I made the place mine, and to make room for the desk in the corner where I wanted it, by the window, I moved out an old trunk that had been sitting there, a heavy old cedar chest shoved into that corner, and I dragged it across the room and out onto the porch to get it out of my way, and I thought nothing of it. It was just clutter, a thing left behind in the way of the life I was setting up. I mention it now because it turned out to matter more than anything else I did up there, but at the time it was nothing. A piece of furniture moved, the most ordinary act in the world. That first night I woke at the dead hour. You know the hour I mean, the one deep in the belly of the night, 3 or 4, when the world is at its lowest ebb and a person alone is most alone. I came awake all at once, the way you do when something wakes you, no drifting up out of sleep, but snapped fully awake in the pitch black of that cabin. And the very first thing I was aware of, before I was even aware of the room, was a certainty. A bone-deep, animal certainty that I was not alone, that there was someone in the room with me. And then, as my eyes found the dark, I saw it, a figure, standing at the foot of my bed, tall and dark, darker than the dark around it, still, upright, and facing me. Just standing there at the foot of the bed in the black room, turned toward where I lay, watching me. And I could not move. I could not lift my head or my hand, could not turn, could not make a sound, could not do anything at all, but lie there flat on my back and be looked at by the shape at the foot of my bed. I strained against it with everything I had, and my body would not answer, locked, held, and so I lay there in that helplessness, and the figure stood and watched me, and the terror of it was a thing I had never known before, a pure and total helplessness under the attention of something in the dark. And it went on, that standing and that watching, until the black in the window finally started to gray with the dawn, and somewhere in that graying I found I could move again. And I jerked upright, gasping, and the room was empty. There was nothing at the foot of the bed. There was nothing in the room but me, the sleep's paralysis. I knew the words, and I reached for them the way a drowning man reaches for anything. It's a known thing, a real thing. The mind waking before the body does, the paralysis of sleep hanging on into consciousness, and the terror and the sense of a presence, and even the dark figure. All of it documented, all of it a trick of a brain caught between sleeping and waking, the oldest and most common of night terrors. I'd never had it before, but there was a first time for everyone. And the isolation, the strange bed, the stress of the work, it made sense that my brain would do this. I believed it, or I made myself believe it, and I got up and made my coffee and I worked. And by daylight it was easy to be a rational man, but it came again the next night, and the night after. Every night, always the same hour, that dead hour, deep in the dark. Always the same waking, snapped all at once into the black with that certainty of not being alone. And always the figure, at the foot of the bed, tall and dark and still, facing me, and always the paralysis, holding me flat and helpless while it watched. Sleep paralysis doesn't do that. I told myself the words for a week, and then I couldn't tell them to myself anymore. Because sleep paralysis is a thing that happens to you, now and again, a misfire, not a thing that comes for you at the same hour every single night, like something keeping an appointment. And there were the other things. The things that got worse, that no explanation covered. Each night, I could see it a little more clearly. The first nights it was only a dark shape, but as the nights went on, the flash of my terror or my adjusting eyes or something showed me more of it, the height and the thinness of it, the set of it, the way it stood, and I did not want to see more of it, and every night I saw more. And each night the paralysis held me longer. The first night it broke at the first gray of dawn, but night by night it held me later, deeper into the light, so that I lay there, frozen, and watched, while the room grew visible around me, while the figure at the foot of the bed grew visible in the strengthening light. And still I could not move, held there to look at it, in the gray dawn, longer and longer each time, before my body was given back to me. I stopped sleeping. What was the point? I'd lie there rigid in the dark, waiting for the dead hour, and it would come, and it would stand, and it would study me. And I would lie helpless and be studied. And I got no rest at all, and the work stopped. And I started to come apart up there alone in that cabin, and I knew I should leave, and some stubbornness or some stupor wouldn't let me. And finally, wrung out and half wild, I drove down to the nearest town, to the little store there, just to be near a human being. And there was a woman working there, an older woman, local, and something in my face must have told her I was in a bad way, because she was kind to me. And it all came out. I told her. The cabin, the figure, the paralysis, the nightly waiting and watching. I told it stumbling and ashamed, expecting her to say, I ought to see a doctor about my sleep. She didn't say that. She didn't call it a dream, or a trick of the brain, or sleep paralysis. She listened with her face getting stiller and stiller, and when I was done, she asked me a question I did not expect. She asked me, had I moved anything in that cabin? Had I disturbed anything, changed anything when I moved in? And I stood there, and the cedar trunk came back to me, the old chest I'd dragged out of the corner that first afternoon to make room for my desk, and I told her about it, the trunk in the corner, how I'd moved it out. And the color went out of her face. She got quiet a moment, and then she told me in a low voice that some things watch over what's theirs, that some things stay with a place, a corner, a spot that was theirs, and they don't like to be moved from it or have their place taken. And then she told me the thing that has stayed in me worse than anything I saw in that cabin, she said. The fellow who'd rented the place before me had cleared out that same corner, had moved that same trunk, and that he'd left inside a week, gone, raving, and that the thing he'd raved about to anyone who'd listened before he got in his car and drove off the mountain and never came back, was that something came at night and stood at the foot of his bed, and that it got closer every night, closer every night. I drove back up to that cabin with those words going around in me, and I looked at my situation with new and horrible clarity, because I had already felt it, hadn't I? I had already felt it getting closer, or clearer, or later, some slow closing of the distance I hadn't let myself name. And I understood, finally, what I'd done. I understood that corner had been its place, that the trunk had marked it, or held it, or belonged to it. That whatever stood at the foot of my bed had a claim on that spot in that room, older than my 2-month rental, and that I had come up there a stranger and dragged its trunk out onto the porch and set my desk in its corner and lain down to sleep in its room as if the room were mine. And it had come, that first night, to look at the one who'd taken its place. And it had been coming every night since, patient, closer, to make me understand, because it is closer now. The woman was right, and I have watched it come the way The man before me watched it come. For weeks it stood at the foot of the bed, but it doesn't stand at the foot of the bed anymore. It has come up the side. Last night I woke at the dead hour to the certainty and the paralysis, and I could not turn my head, but I did not need to, because it was not at the foot of the bed. It was beside it. Standing over me at the side of the bed, close, and then leaning down, bending toward me in the dark. Close enough that I would have felt its breath if it breathed. Close enough that the dark of it filled the whole side of my vision, and I lay there frozen, and it leaned down over me, and I understood, at last, the thing it had been so patient to make me understand. It was not watching me anymore. The watching was over. The watching had only ever been the beginning, the long, slow announcing of a thing that was owed. It was leaning down over me in the dark to make me know, finally and completely, that I was the one who had come into its room, that I had taken its place, that I had cleared its corner and laid myself down in the dark where it used to lie, and that it had been waiting, patient, night after night, drawing closer, for me to understand that the bed I was lying in, helpless in the dead hour, in the deep woods where no one would come, had never been mine at all. I leased a piece of bottomland in Allegheny County a few years back to put in corn, good, flat, rich ground down along a creek, the kind of bottom that's hard to come by in that steep country where most of the land stands on end. It belonged to an old farmer named Ackley, a man well up in his 80s, the last of his family on a place they'd held since before anybody kept records, and he was past working it himself, but couldn't bear to let it lie fallow. So he leased the bottom out to me for the corn. He was a decent old man, close-mouthed the way the old mountain farmers are, and the terms were fair and simple, and there was only the one condition, and it was strange enough that I remembered it. Along the edge of that bottom, where the field met the woods, there was a line of scarecrows, and old Ackley made me promise, as a plain condition of the lease, that I would leave them be, not move them, not take them down, not touch them. Just work the field and let the scarecrows stand. I thought it was an odd thing to make a point of, but it was his land and his business, and I agreed easy enough. They were sorry old things, those scarecrows, a whole line of them strung along the tree line, more than any field needed. You put up a scarecrow or two, not a dozen, and they were old, weathered gray, the clothes on them rotted to rags, stuffed with straw gone dark, and packed with the years, each one on its cross of posts, sunk in the ground at the field's edge. Ragged, faceless mostly, their feed-sack heads gone shapeless. But they were his, and his condition was clear, and I honored it. I worked around them all that first season and paid them no mind. The way you stop seeing anything that stands still long enough. And they were just part of the edge of that field, the line where my corn stopped, and the dark woods began. It was the second season I noticed the first one had turned. I'd been working the bottom since first light, and I came up to the top end near the tree line, and something caught at me, some small wrongness, the way it does when a familiar thing is off, and your eye knows before your mind. And I stopped and looked and worked out what it was. One of the scarecrows was facing the wrong way. All of them, all down that line, faced out over the field, the way a scarecrow ought to, looking over the corn to frighten the crows off it. But this one, near the middle of the line, had turned. It faced the woods now. Its back was to my field, and its blank sacking face was turned in toward the tree line, toward the dark under the trees, as if it had lost interest in the crows and the corn, and had turned to look at something back in the woods instead. I figured the wind, though it was a still stretch of days. I figured kids, though there wasn't a house for miles. I figured the post had worked loose, and the thing had swung around on it. And I walked over, and I turned it back to face the field, and I had to work the post a little to seat it, and I thought no more about it and went back to my corn. The next morning it faced the woods again. I turned it back again, and again the next morning it had come around to face the trees, and I'll admit that started to work on me a little, but I still had it filed under some natural thing, a loose post, a prevailing wind I couldn't feel, and I turned it back a few more times before I gave it up. And it was while I'd given it up, while I'd started just letting that one face the woods, because I was tired of fighting it, that I noticed a second one had turned, and then over the following weeks, a third and a fourth. One by one, down the line, the scarecrows were coming around. Slow, never while I watched. But morning by morning another of them would have its back to my field, and its blank face turned in toward the tree line, and I understood after a while that they were all doing it, the whole line of them turning, one at a time, to stop facing the field and start facing the woods, to stop watching the corn and start watching the trees. As if, all together, they'd decided there was something more worth watching back in the dark under the trees than any crow in any cornfield. As if they were watching for something to come out of it. Or, and this thought came to me one evening at the field's edge and would not leave, as if they had been set there to face the field in order to keep watch on the woods at their backs, to keep something in, and were now one by one breaking from that, turning around, giving up their posts, coming around to face the woods, and side with whatever was in there. I went to old Ackley about it. I found him on his porch, and I told him, half sheepish, that his scarecrows kept turning to face the woods, that I'd turned them back, and they kept coming around. And did he know why? Was there something to it? And the old man wouldn't meet my eye. He looked off at the mountains, and his face did something, tightened. And there was a long silence before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had gone low and careful. He said his father had set those scarecrows, and his father before him, that they'd stood along that field edge longer than the old man had been alive, kept up and replaced and restuffed by the men of his family for as far back as the family went, and that they had never, whatever I might think, been for the crows. He said they'd never once been about the crows. They faced the field, he said, to watch the woods. That was the whole purpose of them. The reason his people had kept a line of them standing there for 100 years and more, set to look out over the field with their backs to the trees so that they were watching the woods, guarding against it, keeping their faces turned toward the house and the field and the road, and their backs set square against whatever was in the timber. A line held, a watch kept, and then he told me the thing I've never gotten out from under. He said, a scarecrow that turns to face the trees has stopped watching for you and started watching with. He said it just like that, and then he said he was tired and he'd talk no more about it, and he went inside, and that was the last real conversations I ever had with him. I don't work that bottom near dark anymore. That's the first thing that changed in me. I do what I have to in the full light of day, and I'm off that field and out the gate before the shadows get long. Because after Ackley told me what he told me, I couldn't stand to be down in that bottom, in the failing light, with that whole line of ragged watchers turned in toward the woods, facing the dark, waiting, siding with it. I kept farming it. God knows why. The corn was in, and a man doesn't walk away from a crop. But I farmed it in daylight, and I kept my eyes off the tree line, and I did not turn the scarecrows back anymore. Because turning them back had started to feel like an argument I did not want to be having with them. But it's past that now. It's gone somewhere worse than the woods, because the scarecrows don't face the woods anymore, and they don't face the field. Sometime this last while, they turned again, all of them, all the way around on their crosses, and now they face the road, they face the gate. They face the one-way in, the gap in the fence at the bottom of the field, where the track comes in off the road, and where I drive through every morning to work that ground. Every one of them has come the whole way around on its post, its blank, sacking face, and its rotted rags turned to watch the gate, and they stand there along that fence line in a row, patient on their crosses, facing the way I come in. And when I drive through that gate in the morning, I drive in under the gaze of the whole silent line of them, turned to watch me arrive, and I have to get down out of the truck and work all day with my back to them, knowing they are all faced my way, watching the gate, waiting. And there are more of them now. That's the thing I check every morning without meaning to, the thing I count now the way you'd worry a sore tooth. Old Ackley set a certain number along that fence, and his fathers before him, and I knew that line. I'd worked past it 2 seasons, and I knew how many there were. There are more now. I don't turn them. I don't touch them. I've never added one, and there is no one else on that land. Old Ackley passed this winter, in his bed, the last of his people, and the land's tied up now, and nobody comes but me. But there are more scarecrows on that fence line than the old man ever set. New ones, standing among the old gray ragged ones, a little less weathered, a little fuller in their rags, turned like all the rest to face the gate. And every so often there's another, and I don't know where they come from, and I have stopped letting myself think about it, about a line of watchers set 100 years ago to keep their backs to the woods and their faces to the field, that turned one by one to face the trees, and then turned again to face the way I come in, and that grows by one now and again along that fence, with no living hand to set it there. I'm going to give up the lease. I've decided that, writing this, I'll let the corn stand and I won't go back. But old Ackley couldn't give it up his whole long life, nor his father before him. And I understand now that keeping that field, keeping that watch, keeping that line of scarecrows facing the right way, was the whole work of that family for 100 years and more. And I understand too, in the cold part of the night, that they never once dared quit it. And I am about to quit it, to drive out that gate one last time under all those turned and patient faces, and leave the woods unwatched, and I have started to wonder what it is I'll be turning my back on, out there in that bottom, when there's no one left at all to face it. I built a small place on a mountainside in Mitchell County to retire to, a modest cabin on a shoulder of the ridge, with a deck that looked out over a wide, deep valley toward the mountains on the far side. And I built it for the quiet, for the view, for the peace a man thinks he's earned after 40 years of work, down in the noise of the world. And I got the quiet, and I got the view, and for a while I thought I'd gotten the peace too. My place sat alone on my slope, no other house in sight, and across the valley the land rose up again to a long ridge. And on that ridge, off to one side, there was a bald, one of those high open knobs you get in that country, a dome of grass and rock standing bare above the timber, catching the last light of the evening after the wooded slopes had gone to shadow. It was a fine thing to look at from my deck of an evening, that bald catching the gold and then the rose of the failing light, while the valley filled up with blue dark below it. I'd sit out with my coffee, or something stronger, and watch the day go down over that far ridge. And I thought I'd found about the most beautiful and peaceful spot a man could end his working life in. It was maybe my 3rd week up there that I first saw the shape on the bald. I was in my chair on the deck at dusk, looking across the valley the way I did, and my eye caught on something up, on the open ground of that far knob that hadn't been there, or that I hadn't noticed before. A shape, a dark shape, up on the high bare ground, against the last light of the sky, and it was sitting. I want to be careful how I say this, because it was far, a good mile of open valley air between my deck and that ridge, too far to make out any detail at all, just a dark form against the pale evening sky. But you know a sitting figure when you see one. There's no mistaking it, even at distance, even as just a silhouette. The hunch of the shoulders, the set of a head above them, the particular compact shape a person makes when they're sitting still with their knees up or their legs folded, looking out. It was a sitting figure, up on the bald, and it was facing my way, facing across the whole width of the valley, facing the one house on the far slope. Mine, I thought, of course, a hiker. Somebody up on the knob taking in the sunset, same as me, the balds being popular for exactly that. I watched it a while, expecting it to get up and move off as the light went, the way a hiker does, heading down before full dark. It didn't. It sat. It sat until the light was gone, and I lost it against the darkening ridge, and I went in and thought little of it. But it was there the next clear evening, and the one after. Same knob, same spot, same sitting shape against the last light, facing across the valley at my house. And no hiker sits the same rock every single evening and never once gets up. Over the following couple of weeks, I came to understand that it was always there, when the sky was clear at dusk, a permanent feature of my evenings, a dark-seated figure on the far bald that faced my house across the valley, and watched the light go down, or watched me, sitting on my deck watching it. I did the thing a curious man does. I bought a spotting scope, a good one, the kind the birders and the long-range shooters use. And I set it up on my deck, and I trained it on the bald one evening to finally see who or what was sitting up there. And here is the first thing that turned my curiosity into something colder. It didn't resolve. I put good glass on it, magnification enough to count the buttons on a man's shirt at that distance, and the shape stayed a shape. A dark-seated form, man-sized, man-shaped, the hunch and the set of it, but no detail would come, no face, no clothes, no color, just a darkness, in the shape of a sitting figure that the scope could not sharpen no matter how I worked the focus. And, worse than that, the scope made the watching worse, made it particular. Through the naked eye, it was a distant shape, and I could tell myself things about it. Through the scope, close, filling the glass, I felt the watching turn specific, felt, in a way I can't defend but can't deny, that when I put my eye to that scope and looked at it, it knew, that the looking went both ways down that glass, that I had, by looking close, let it know I saw it, and that it felt me seeing it. And I took my eye off the scope with my heart going, and I did not put it to that thing again. It was an old man in the valley who told me the rest, one of the last of the families that had lived in that country for generations. And I got to talking with him at the little store down the mountain and worked my way around to asking, casual, whether anybody ever hiked up to the bald across from my place of an evening, whether it was a popular spot. And he looked at me, and he knew exactly what I was really asking. I could see it, and he asked me had I seen the sitter. Just like that, the sitter. And when I allowed that I had, he nodded slow, and he told me that people had seen a figure sitting on that bald for as long as anybody in that valley could remember. 100 years, he said, more, that it sat up there on the knob at dusk, and watched whatever house stood where mine stood now, that there'd been other houses on my slope over the generations, and it had watched every one of them, sat up on its bald, and watched the families come and go on the far side of the valley, and that the way of it, the thing everyone in that valley grew up knowing, was that you left it alone. You didn't go up to the bald looking for it. You didn't signal it, or challenge it, or try to get to the bottom of it. As long as it stayed up on the knob, sitting, watching, you let it sit and watch. And you counted yourself lucky. And you went on with your life, on your side of the valley. And it went on with whatever it was doing on its side. I asked him the question you have to ask. I asked what it meant if it didn't stay up on the knob. What it meant if it came down, and the old man went quiet. He'd been easy enough talking about it up to then, matter of fact. The way the old people are, about the things they've lived alongside their whole lives. But that question stopped him, and he was a while answering. And then he said that he'd only heard of that happening the once. A long time ago, before his time, told to him by the old people, when he was a boy, that there'd been a family on my slope, and that one autumn the sitter had come down off its bald, and that the family it came down to had not stayed a family very long after. He wouldn't say more than that, and I didn't press him, because there are ways of saying a thing that tell you the whole of it isn't for telling. And he had that way about him. And we talked of other things, and I drove home. And I went back to living alongside it, the way he'd said you did, the way the valley always had. The sitter on the bald and me on my deck, a mile of air between us. Each of us watching the other, watch the light go down. I won't pretend I made my peace with it, but I made an arrangement with it. The arrangement the whole valley had always made. I left it alone, up on its knob, and I counted myself lucky it stayed there, and the summer went on, and the fall came on, and every clear evening, it sat on its bald facing my house, and I sat on my deck and did not put the scope to it again. And there was a strange, dreadful ordinariness to it, the way there is to anything you live with long enough, until the last clear evening. I came out onto my deck at dusk, the way I always did, with the light going gold across the far ridge, and I looked across at the bald, the way I always did, the first thing my eyes did anymore. Gone to that knob out of habit and dread both. And the bald was empty. The high open ground stood bare against the pale sky, catching the last of the light, and there was no dark-seated shape upon it. The sitter was gone. For the first time in 100 years, by the old man's telling, for the first time in longer than anyone in that valley had been alive. The knob was empty at dusk, and the shape that had sat upon it, watching my slope through all those generations, was not there. And I stood on my deck with the cold coming into me, because I understood, all at once, the thing I had not thought to be afraid of. It had not gone up. There was nowhere up to go. The bald was the top, the high open ground, and above it there was only sky. It had not gone over the far side of the ridge, back into its own country. Because a thing does not sit and watch one house across a valley for 100 years, and then one evening wander off home. There was only one direction for it to have gone off that knob, only one place its 100 years of patient watching had ever been pointed. It had come down. Down off the bald, down the wooded far slope, into the blue dark of the valley bottom, down toward the one thing it had ever watched. And a valley is only so wide. A mile of air is nothing to a thing that has been patient for 100 years. I have spent every night since out here on my deck in the dark. I can't make myself go in. I can't make myself not watch. Looking out over the black valley between my slope and that empty ridge, listening to the dark, because it is out there somewhere in that mile of night, crossing, slow, in no hurry at all, coming up the near slope toward the one house it has watched for 100 years. And there is no one left in that valley who ever knew what to do. When the sitter comes down, and the old man wouldn't tell me what became of the family it came down to, except that they did not stay a family long. And I sit here in the dark, and I watch and I listen, and I cannot tell you which I am more afraid of. The evening the bald is empty again, and I still can't see where it's gotten to, or the evening I finally do.